Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Avenging Varus Part 3, Battle of the Long Bridges. Last time we saw more Roman victories under Germanicus, but we ended with one Roman army under Caecina being put in a pretty dangerous situation by Arminius. Will we see a repeat of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, or will these Roman legions be able to escape back across the Rhine? That's what we'll be seeing this time. I'm excited to get into this one, but before I do, if you guys would like to see exclusive reaction content, then please check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. And with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Ever since they had taken the offensive, the legions had dealt a punishing string of blows to the Germanic tribes.
Yeah.
Entire villages and towns had been wiped out, with pillaging, burning, and mass slaughter, creating a wasteland beyond the Rhine.
To fulfill its vengeance, we have so far seen Rome wage a brutal military campaign against these Germanic tribes, very successfully so far.
The campaigns at the end of 15 AD in particular had seen a massive assault by the legions which had pushed Arminius deep into the forests of the east. However, with winter approaching, the Romans had finally been forced to relent and were now receding like a tide back to their bases on the frontier. This critical moment opened a window of opportunity for Arminius.
Despite all of their victories, this is still relatively unfamiliar and hostile territory for the Romans. And so when winter comes, when the campaigning slows down, they have to retreat back westwards across the Rhine, back to the safety of Gaul. That gives Arminius and the Germans a bit of an opportunity.
Long bridges, he had managed to trap 4 legions upon their retreat against the marshes and once again made ready to repeat his master stroke of Teutoburg Forest. The tribes had suffered long enough at the hands of the invader. Here, they would make the Romans pay. Here, they would renew the hope of victory.
Battle of the Long Bridges, and that's what I said in the introduction. What's going to happen here? Are these Romans under Caecina, or Caecina, that's the correct pronunciation, will they manage to defeat the Germans? Will they manage to escape? Or will we see a repeat of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest? Will they be trapped, ambushed, and defeated? I don't know. We'll have to watch to find out.
Caecina had made the decision to commit to the crossing at the Long Bridges rather than try to force his way around. This meant dividing his forces in 2, one for repairs and one for defense. They began immediately. Screening forces fanned out to secure the perimeter, while lignatories collected building materials, cohorts dug trenches, and engineering squads planned construction works.
Yeah, and like I said, he made a very typically Roman decision, which I thought was a little funny. He decided, alright, we're going to make camp, we'll defend our camp, and we will set about repairing these bridges. So Roman in nature, establishing your camp, defending it, using engineering to find a way around the issue, using all these rather common Roman tactics.
The Germanic tribes, meanwhile, occupied the high ground above, and were similarly active. They set up their own positions in the hills, sent out raiding parties to harass the enemy, and began their own counter-engineering works to divert nearby streams towards the Romans to further flood their positions. That first day was an incredible sight of frenzied activity. Like a pair of disturbed anthills, the opposing armies swarmed over the area to complete their missions while thwarting that of the enemy. In these contests, the Romans had the advantage of experience and technical expertise. However, the tribes had the advantage of the terrain, their knowledge of the area, and their vast numbers.
Right.
The legionary work crews were forced to trudge through wet and muddy conditions under a near constant barrage of slingstones and light javelins.
Yeah, and this is a fairly typical engagement when we talk about Rome conquering foreign lands. The advantages held by the Romans and the advantages held by these Germans. Pretty normal stuff, but, the Romans have been sort of hemmed in, so they're in a bit of a disadvantageous position, not to mention that this is some very marshy swampland, not necessarily ideal territory to be fighting upon, so I would say on top of the usual advantages and disadvantages, the Romans are definitely in a dangerous position, and Arminius has caught them at a vulnerable point. He has managed to sort of trap them in. Now, of course, as we discussed, Caecina could fight his way back eastwards, but he's decided not to. So, I guess we'll see how this goes down. Both sides have advantages, both sides have disadvantages, but the Romans have been caught in a tricky situation, though. You can usually trust the Roman legions to stand strong and defend their position, so you really can't tell which way it's going to go from this point.
What few Roman fortifications managed to go up became magnets for such attacks, which whittled away the defenders with incessant harassment. The legionaries which attempted to strike back were said to be heavily encumbered by the mud, barely able to advance or throw their pila.
Right.
Thankfully, the fearless generalship of Caecina managed to see them through to nightfall. They were alive, but had little to show for it. Much of their progress had been undone by the attacks or the unexpected flooding that had been unleashed by the barbarians. Food supplies were dropping, the wounded or dying were piling up, and morale was on the verge of collapse.
Oh, okay, so it's getting a lot worse for the Romans. You see, the thing is, the Romans have to get out of here, whether they fight their way back eastwards, which is another risky proposition, or they manage to continue west. The one thing they can't do is stay where they are. They're in a dangerous situation, they're running out of supplies, morale is falling low. They cannot afford to spend their entire day fighting off these Germanic tribes and dealing with the harsh environment. They need to spend their day rebuilding these bridges and moving across them. So they're really going to have to speed it up if they want to get out of here, or they're going to have to defeat Arminius and his soldiers. That's the other option, though a dangerous one.
Meanwhile, on the dry ground above, they could see the warm fires of the barbarian tribes and hear the raucous laughter of an enemy in high spirits.
Damn.
Tomorrow's prospects were grim.
Yeah.
Caecina knew that inaction and complacency would breed despair in the situation. They needed some ray of hope to cling to fight for. He therefore called a meeting of the senior leadership and consulted with...
And I have to imagine if you're, your average Roman soldier, or really anyone taking part in this, you've been up lately. You've been, going around German territory, burning down villages, winning battles. You're in high spirits. But you get into this dangerous situation, the more hopeless it appears, I imagine the more you might think back on the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Go, oh my god. Sure, we've been winning victories lately, but we're back in that situation. We're trapped. It's hopeless, and I imagine that could lead you to great despair and fear. So, trying to keep the morale of your men up, as it seems Caecina is doing, or at least is, thinking about, that's a good thing to do. Their morale needs to be high. You don't want them falling into despair and fear.
With the engineers on what could be done. They decided that it would be possible to begin marching across the partially completed bridge works. While this would not get them back home, it would at least represent some forward progress and should greatly reduce the enemy's ability to strike at them.
Right.
The orders were passed down through the chain of command, yet even he was not assured of its success. Tacitus writes that night, Caecina was haunted by a nightmare where he had seen General Varus rising out of the swamps.
Well, there you go. Even Caecina's worried about this. I said if you're your average soldier, this is going through Caecina's mind as well. Well, that's if this story is true. This very well could have been made up afterwards. Caecina might not have had this nightmare, and he might not have been thinking about this in that way, but, this is what Tacitus tells us.
Covered in blood, extending his hand and beckoning to him. Such an ill omen was not to be shared with the men, lest they lose all hope. He must trust in the plan. At dawn, the legions marched out. They assembled into a massive square formation with the baggage train at its center and a legion on each side.
All right.
The advance across the long bridges was painfully slow. The heavier baggage carts and cavalry forces carefully moved across the groaning causeway.
Yeah, I understand the need to move everybody forward to give the men some sense of forward momentum. I think that's a good idea, but I'm just imagining, especially in this formation with the terrible environment and with the baggage train in the middle, how slowly you would be moving through this swamp. That has got to make you incredibly vulnerable to attack. I'd be very concerned about this.
While the lighter infantry and auxiliaries waded through the marshes on the flanks. Arminius and the tribes watched like some famished bird of prey. Patient, they merely sent forth harassing units to delay the rear guard, while keeping the bulk of their troops at the ready.
Okay.
The Romans were maintaining a tight perimeter, and their discipline was holding out. But this would not last forever. As the legions moved forward into the marshes, their supply train, aptly called the impedimenta, became bogged down. Seeing this, the square was forced to slow and come to a halt.
There you go. It's that supply train, impedimenta. I assume that has something to do with the English word impediment. I assume that's why they said it. You know, it was a fitting name.
As the sun rose higher in the sky and the hours of the day ticked by, it seems that the soldiers had enough of merely watching their military slaves struggling to keep the mules and wagons moving. They therefore began to abandon their positions as guards to help things move along. The tidy order of the defensive square broke apart.
Okay. I mean, once again, I understand the reasoning. You're moving so slowly. You think, you know what? It's safer to just get out of this scenario. We cannot afford to be here a second longer than we need to. But in doing that, you are even further opening yourself up to attack. I wonder if Arminius is going to catch this opportunity and take it.
It was this exact moment of weakness that Arminius had been waiting for.
Of course.
He now ordered the assault.
He's good.
Vast waves of tribal forces ran screaming down the hills and crashed upon the disoriented Roman rear. The attack proved devastating. Arminius himself led a picked force of men that cut through the legions and their animals, heading for the soft innards of the baggage train, which held the supplies, the wounded, the officer corps, and the eagles.
Oh no.
As he advanced, the chieftain is reported to have
You cannot let Arminius take another eagle standard. Oh no.
called out that this was Varus and his legions, trapped once again in their ancient doom.
Yeah.
Indeed, the situation was quickly spiraling into a disaster.
Oh god. Yeah. I mean, that's what I would be worried about at that point too. It looks like it's going the exact same way. Now, I don't think it'll end up as badly as that battle, but if you're here right now, you know, if you're Arminius or the Germans, you're thinking, we've done it again! We've won another amazing victory against the Romans. They're about to be crushed. And if you're a Roman, I think there's a good chance you're thinking, they've done it again! We're about to be destroyed. You're falling into despair and terror, thinking about what is about to happen here. You know, it looks like it could be going the same way as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which was the inciting incident for this whole thing.
The Roman force was holding together by a mere thread. Most of its units abandoned the long bridges, fighting their way back towards the more defensible dry land from which they had come. The integrity of the defensive square was thus entirely gone, leaving Caecina dangerously exposed. Germanic forces closed in, cutting the horse out from under the Roman commander and almost killing him. Luckily, the units from the vanguard came to his rescue and helped escort the remaining forces back to terra firma.
Yeah, the first legion showed up, helped Caecina out, and by that I mean basically saved his ass. After his horse was killed from under him, you can see how dangerous of a situation this was. Caecina is in it, along with the rest of the soldiers.
They did so at great cost, as the wounded or isolated elements of their forces had to be abandoned. In their wake, the Germanic troops swarmed in to engulf what was left behind. They took prisoners, killed stragglers, and raided the abandoned tools, tents, supplies, and valuables that clogged the sunken battlefield. Perhaps the only silver lining to be had was that this led the barbarians to lose their own cohesion, which allowed the Romans the time they needed to regroup.
Yeah, so let's look at where we are. The Romans have lost a lot of the progress they had made. Not that they had made that much progress. They have endured a defeat. But this is not yet as devastating, nearly as devastating as the Teutoburg Forest. They have managed to maintain, I believe, most of their army, or at least a good chunk of it. They have regrouped, got back into formation, or at least attempting to get back into formation. As they said, the Germanic troops got a little bit distracted by the baggage train, which I'm sure they wanted to plunder very badly. If they had once again fallen upon the Romans as they were trying to regroup, maybe this already would be a disaster at the scale of the Teutoburg Forest. But as of this moment, it isn't. It could become that, or the situation could be salvaged. We'll see what happens from here.
The surviving legions had escaped the defeat with the eagles and not much else. They had no food, no shelter, and few tools for making camp.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's on the verge of becoming a disaster of Teutoburg scale. It is close, but there's a chance that they can manage to avoid that.
Thus, as the sun began to set, they were left to build a most pitiful camp. Its walls were made of makeshift sod, topped by an assortment of scavenged materials, while its insides were a waterlogged field of cold, drenched, bloodied soldiers who mostly slept out in the elements.
Man.
They huddled together for warmth and ate what few rations they had in their own personal belongings. Within 24 hours, the legions had found themselves back where they started the day before, but now in a far more dire situation.
God, imagine how demoralizing. They said that the soldiers were becoming demoralized before. Imagine how much worse it is now. As they said, they're back at square one. They've lost all of their progress. They've also lost their baggage train, most of their supplies. They probably lost most of their wounded comrades. A bunch of men have died in fighting. So, a pretty horrible situation to be in. You can imagine how demoralized you might be.
Things truly seemed hopeless. It's certain that many soldiers spent the night haunted by nightmarish visions of the aftermath of Teutoburg that they had discovered just a few months earlier. Surely it would be their skulls next that would be pinned to the trees. The men were so on edge that when at one point one of the surviving horses broke its tether and ran screaming through the camp, the legions panicked and attempted to swarm out of the gate, thinking that the enemy was closing in upon them. The entire army was on the verge of dissolving into a rout. The catastrophe was only averted by the quick thinking of Kaikina. The general, aware of the latest reports and knowing that this was a false alarm, threw himself before the exit, vowing that the only way out would be over his dead body.
Yeah, and the image they're showing here is Kaikina standing with the sword, but when they say he threw himself, to my understanding, he literally threw himself in front of the exit and said to them, "You're gonna have to stop me. You're gonna have to climb over me if you want to get out of here. So, unless you want that to happen, you better stop right now." Fair enough. Sometimes you gotta take sort of a radical, drastic move in order to encourage your men, and that's what Kaikina did here. Hey, that's a sign of a good leader. You know when you have to put yourself on the line. Now, well, I guess the bet he was making is that they wouldn't trample him, and I agree. I don't think that was ever really a possibility, but, sometimes you gotta put yourself out there in order to show your men that you're willing to put yourself out there for their sake, for their benefit. And so this is the kind of action that Kaikina is taking. You can respect that. He's saying, look, it's not over. We can do this, unless you want to trample me right now. Get back in line, and we'll prepare for tomorrow.
The sight of their commander seems to have shaken the men out of their animalistic flight response. He took the opportunity to address the assembled mob in stride by proclaiming that beyond those gates lay death alone. Their only hope for survival was as a disciplined whole. As individuals, they would be picked off one by one.
And, he's so right, but imagine how terrifying that sounds. Outside those walls is death. Death alone. One by one, we'll be picked off. We'll be killed. My goodness. Imagine the fear that all of these men are feeling. The terror of being surrounded, as far as they know, in the darkness of night. Walking straight into a massacre, potentially. The only thing that can save them is if they stick together and stay disciplined. And that is true. And, also something that Kaikina absolutely needs to impart upon them, which he is taking this opportunity to do.
With these careful words, and perhaps an appeal to their remaining sense of honor, the men were back down from the ledge of mutiny. The army would hold together one more night. Kaikina knew that he would not have many more.
Yeah. If it was that bad right there, how many more nights do you think they have left before the men simply break and run, probably running straight to their death?
A plan was thus devised that would make or break the legions. At dawn the next morning, the ramparts of the camp were all but empty. Some nervous sentries were posted, but it was obvious to the German scouts that the legions must be exhausted and on the breaking point, refusing to even commit to their usual full guard. They summoned a war council in the face of this new information. Arminius was cautious. He knew best that a cornered beast was at its most dangerous. Better to let it bleed out in the corner or set a trap along the escape routes than gamble on some unnecessary killing blow.
And if I'm in that war council, knowing what has happened up until this point, I'm saying, let's listen to Arminius. He knows what he's doing. I mean, this is a competent, talented guy. He has this Roman education. He knows how the Romans work. He's seen so much success. I'm saying, all right, I'll stick with Arminius' plan. But other people feel differently.
However, his council was overruled by the other chiefs. This fight was personal to them.
Yep. And look, you got to remember that we talked about this before. Now, Roman discipline is wavering a little at this moment, but generally, the Romans are extremely disciplined. They are united under a singular cause, under a singular commander in this case, and so it's easier for them to act as one. The issue that the Germans often have is that they are a coalition. Now, they are united to a certain extent, but that unity is easy to break down, and someone like Arminius, even though he is in charge, he does not have ultimate power. Now, of course, even Caecina doesn't have ultimate power, as we saw here, even though he's the one in charge of the Romans, but he can act more unilaterally than Arminius does. If the war council disagrees, then, Arminius could object, but he basically has to go along with it, and that's what he does here.
Many had lost friends and family over the last few years, and were eager to see them avenged. They were done waiting. The fighting the day before had proven the Romans mortal. Their army bled. It was battered and broken, lying in a camp fortified with mere mounds of sod and a handful of guards. Now was the time to fulfill oaths. Now was the time to end this man to man.
And it's just now isn't the time, actually. This is what happens when you bring your personal emotions in so strongly. You can tell that these men are acting on feeling and basically feeling alone, whereas Arminius, he's sticking to the plan. Look what he's done so far in this battle. Did he immediately rush the Romans when he arrived? As soon as he saw them moving across the bridges, did Arminius, send all of his men to attack them? No. He waited until he saw an opening, until the formation broke and they became vulnerable, and then he pounced to great success. Arminius is staying consistent. He's saying, let's do the same thing here. We don't need to rush into an attack. We can starve them out. We can block the exits. We can wait until they show some weakness, some vulnerability, because though they are demoralized, though they are weak, they are sticking together. They're clearly preparing for some sort of fight. But the other war chiefs, like I said, they've got their personal feelings caught up in it, and they're saying, screw that. We're just going to go for it. Victory is so close, we can reach out and touch it. Let's grab it. All right, let's see how that plan goes.
The Germanic tribes promptly massed their ranks and unleashed an all-out assault, each tribal chief leading their contingents into the fray. The vanguard moved quickly, with bundles of branches to fill in trenches and with tools to tear down anything that might slow the assault. Soon, they were at the ramparts, clearing it with volleys of javelins and scaling it with their hands or prepared ladders. Led by Arminius, they flooded into the camp. However, it became difficult to maintain cohesion of the force as it spread out in all directions to slaughter and loot mindlessly. This was exactly what Caecina had counted on. At this pivotal moment, he sounded the trumpets. Ranks of troops now emerged from their hidden positions, leading a counter-assault against the overflowing ramparts.
There you
They
go, the
reclaimed
Romans.
walls with
Romans laid a bit of a trap of their own. Pulled a bit of a Germanic maneuver there. And, of course, as expected, the Germans found it difficult to keep formation and keep discipline as they moved into the Roman camp. They're getting split up, they're plundering, they're looting, they're getting distracted. And so it gives the Romans an opportunity to strike back.
with centurions carefully directing the men to repel fresh waves of tribesmen and to cut off those inside. At the same time, all surviving Roman horsemen rode out from the rear of the camp to strike at the Germanic horde from the flank beyond the wall. Additional gates were flung open, unleashing yet more formed cohorts which poured out to engage the main body of the enemy.
And I will remind you that if we think back on the Roman situation of last night, the men were extremely demoralized, the Romans have virtually no supplies left, they're in a dire situation. Imagine if the Germans had gone with Arminius' plan. Wait and see, lure them into a trap, block off the exits. I think they would have been done for. Caecina was really staking it all on this final attack, this final ambush, And these Germanic tribes, ignoring the advice of the successful Arminius, fell right into it,
forcing them into a set-piece battle. The Germanic tribes were caught completely off guard. They had expected cowering, half-armed men in a panic, not disciplined, organized legionaries. This misjudgment would prove their undoing. The legions...
I mean, this is due to two things. One, just the discipline and strength of the Roman legions, but in this situation in particular, I'd say due to the leadership of Caecina. You know, his speech that last night, throwing himself in front of his men, I think you can really credit a lot of the courage and discipline being shown at this moment to his leadership, his personal leadership of his men.
Now held the advantage of surprise and the ability to finally fight the type of battle they wanted. It was said that the Romans yelled out to the enemy, "None of your trees here, none of your swamps, just a fair field and fair gods."
Yep. Perfect fighting ground for the Romans. What a great idea.
Pent-up frustration and a fear of what might happen should they fail, the legions delivered a brutal, merciless counterpunch. The fighting would continue until the sun had set. Many Germanic chieftains were injured or killed, and Arminius only barely managed to escape. Under cover of night, they pulled back. Somehow, the Romans had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Yet Caecina knew that his great victory had only won him a bit of breathing room with which to escape.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a Roman victory in the end, and the Romans themselves claimed that, especially once this whole thing was done, it was seen as a great Roman victory, but if we look at it in context, it is a victory. But overall, we're in a little more of an inconclusive position. Sure, the Romans have managed to fend off these Germanic tribes, but they're still in a dangerous position, low on supplies. They still need to get back across the Rhine, and they're still at great risk. So, yes, though this was a victory, it's not like it solved all of their problems.
Should he linger, the tribes might be able to regroup and smash the legions, which had expended the last of their energy in this desperate bid for survival. He therefore ordered them to march out immediately for the Rhine. After several long days, they finally arrived as a ragged, bloodied, exhausted column that could barely be recognized as a Roman army. During their absence, a panic had set in on the...
I mean, definitely the right move, though, in my opinion. You win this battle, you immediately get yourselves out of there.
Frontier, with many fearing another Teutoburg had occurred.
Yeah.
Some even argued that the bridge over the Rhine should be destroyed to prevent a Germanic invasion. Luckily, Agrippina, wife of Germanicus, had forbidden such an action. She believed in the strength of Rome and dutifully awaited their return. As Caecina's troops finally stumbled into view, the Domina was there to greet them with coins, clothing, medicine, and food.
Hey, there you go. Hey, she held the faith. How about that? She believed in them.
They had survived. Germanicus, meanwhile, had been making his own return home along the northern coast. As his fleet approached a tricky patch of sea, 2 legions were disembarked and marched alongside the ships to facilitate the crossing. For a while, these advanced along a peaceful shore. However, strong winds soon bore down on them, and a severe tide drove the swells against them. I'll now quote an evocative passage from Tacitus. Quote, "His army was driven and tossed hither and thither. The country too was flooded. Sea, shore, fields..."
It was always a good reminder seeing scenes like these that seafaring before the modern era, especially before the industrial era, was extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. It was also just, a lot of it was completely unknown. I mean, you can see this from a lot of ancient seafaring. We're looking at the Romans in particular. The most safe thing to do, and really, in most cases, the only thing you could do, was sail along the coast. If you went out a little further into the sea, well, good luck, you're lost. And even then, you're still faced with a variety of weather situations and climate disasters that you could encounter, which made this whole seafaring thing extremely, extremely dangerous. You can see why people were so scared of the ocean at this point.
Presented one aspect, nor could the treacherous quicksands be distinguished from solid ground or shallows from deep water. Men were swept away by the waves or sucked under by eddies. Beasts of burden, baggage, lifeless bodies floated about and blocked their way. The companies were mingled in confusion, now with the breast, now with the head only above water, sometimes losing their footing, parted from their comrades, or drowned. The voice of mutual encouragement availed not against the adverse forces of the waves. There was nothing to distinguish the brave from the coward, the prudent from the careless, forethought from chance. The same strong power swept everything before it. At last, Vitellius struggled.
Yeah, and you can also see why, an ancient people would so associate the terrors of the sea with the gods above. You have a situation like this which you don't entirely understand that is so all-encompassing. Like they said, it really erases any sort of divisions between these men. Doesn't matter if you're a coward or you're brave, if you're prepared or if you're not. Nothing matters at this point. Everyone's on equal footing. You can imagine surviving that, looking up and saying, well, must be the gods above. Only they could cause something so truly momentous to happen.
Out to higher ground and led his men up to it. There, they passed the night without necessary food, without fire, many of them with bare or bruised limbs, in a plight as pitiable as that of men besieged by an enemy.
Jesus.
For such at least have the opportunity of a glorious death, while here was destruction without honor.
Yeah.
Daylight finally restored land to their sight, and they pushed their way to the river Visurgis, where Caesar had arrived with the fleet. The legions then embarked, while a rumor was flying about that they were all drowned. Nor was there a belief in their safety, till they saw Caesar and the army returned finally. In this way,
well, Jesus, quite an end to the campaigning season. The campaigning itself was pretty damn successful. We saw a lot of Roman victories. They really brutally fought back against these Germanic tribes, brutally imposed their vengeance, but in the end, we have this technical victory from Caecina, but we have his men returning over the Rhine, bruised, battered, probably shell-shocked after this harrowing encounter, and we have the men of Germanicus returning in probably a similar state after this disaster that they've endured. So, geez, quite an end to this season.
The legions of Germanicus crawled their way back to their own lines. It was a dour note on which to end an otherwise glorious campaigning season.
Yeah, exactly.
His men were battered in both body and spirit. In their current state, it would be impossible to carry on the fight. Luckily, this last dark chapter of the war had not yet reached the rest of the empire. As far as they knew, it had been nothing but inspiring tales of conquest. The provinces of Gaul, Spain, and Italy all now competed to offer men, horses, arms, and gold for the war effort. With these, the tattered remnants of the legions were renewed. Morale swelled as the general and his lieutenants made the rounds of the winter camps, visiting the wounded, rewarding the deserving, and showering all with praise.
Yeah, I imagine after a little bit of time passed that how bad the ending was would sort of fade away. Now, sure, both of these armies under Caecina and Germanicus had ended this whole season off in a very harrowing manner, but I imagine, as the winter goes on, the weeks and the months pass, that sort of fades a little bit as Germanicus comes around, visits the injured soldiers, reminds everybody of the very successful campaigning season, all the victories they had won, all the glory and honor they had earned for Rome. You can imagine how after a bit of time, the morale would start to raise up again.
Veterans and raw recruits alike were assured that the ultimate victory was within their grasp. All it would take was one more campaign like the last.
Oh.
They made ready for war.
Alrighty. They make ready for war, and that is what we will see next time. This was a good episode. The Battle of the Long Bridges, one that I was a little bit familiar with. I think it was one of the more famous battles from this whole conflict, and you can see why it had the potential to be another Teutoburg Forest, but this time the Romans managed to successfully fight back and escape, partially due to the leadership of Caecina, and partially due to a big mistake amongst the leadership of the Germanic tribes, which, as I pointed out, Arminius disagreed with, but he was overruled. Maybe they should listen to him. Anyway, this was a great episode. If you guys enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.